technology was pure delusion. The Sun Gun project reveals something important about desperate governments during wartime. When conventional weapons aren't enough, leaders sometimes embrace magical thinking over practical solutions. They want to believe in super weapons that can win wars instantly, even when those weapons violate basic laws of physics and engineering. Other nations weren't immune to similar flights of fancy, but few matched the sheer ambition of Nazi Germany's space mirror. While the Sun Gun never threatened anyone except German taxpayers, it shows how far military planners were willing to go in search of ultimate weapons. Speaking of ultimate weapons, the Nazis weren't the only ones dreaming up impossible military technology. The British had their own bizarre engineering project that seemed almost as crazy, except theirs involved building massive warships out of frozen water. After the Nazis dismissed their impossible Sun Gun project, the British were cooking up their own fantastical engineering marvel. But instead of melting cities from space, they wanted to build something that sounded equally crazy, an aircraft carrier made of ice. The idea came from Geoffrey Pike, a British inventor who had a reputation for thinking way outside the box. The man was brilliant, eccentric, and completely unafraid of proposing ideas that made engineers scratch their heads. In 1942, he walked into a military meeting and suggested they solve their aircraft carrier shortage by freezing seawater into floating runways. The room went silent. Then someone asked if he was serious. He was dead serious. Pike had done his homework. Regular ice wouldn't work. Everyone knew that. But what if they mixed ice with something else? Something that would make it stronger than concrete, and nearly indestructible. That's when he introduced the world to pykrete, named after himself with typical British modesty. Pykrete wasn't just frozen water, it was a mixture of ice and wood pulp, creating a material so tough it could stop bullets. When you shot at regular ice, it shattered like glass. When you shot at pykrete, the bullet bounced off. The wood fibers acted like reinforcement bars in concrete, except this concrete floated and could be shaped into massive ships. The British military was intrigued enough to give Pike funding for Project Habakkuk, named after a biblical prophet. The plan was ambitious beyond belief. They wanted to build ice ships 2,000 feet long, longer than most modern cruise ships. These floating fortresses would carry fighter planes and bombers across the Atlantic, providing air cover where no traditional carrier could reach. What made pykrete so special? The wood pulp created a network of fibers throughout the ice, making it incredibly resistant to cracking and melting. A pykrete ship could theoretically take torpedo hits without sinking. The explosive would blast a hole, but the surrounding material would hold together. Meanwhile, the ship's refrigeration system would slowly repair the damage by refreezing the wounded sections. Tests showed pykrete melted much slower than regular ice, even in warm temperatures. A block of pure ice might last a few hours in summer heat, but pykrete could survive for days. This meant the ice carriers could operate in warmer waters without dissolving beneath their crew's feet. The engineering challenges were enormous. How do you keep a 2,000-foot ice ship frozen while sailing through tropical waters? The British designed elaborate refrigeration systems powered by the ship's engines. Giant cooling pipes would run throughout the hull, maintaining the pykrete at the perfect temperature. They even planned insulation systems to protect the ice from enemy fire and solar heating. Early prototypes were built in Canadian lakes, where winter temperatures helped with construction. Workers would spray layers of pykrete mixture, allowing each section to freeze solid before adding the next. The process was slow but effective. Small-scale models proved the concept worked. Pykrete ships could float, carry weight, and survive damage that would sink steel vessels. But Project Habakkuk faced problems nobody had anticipated. The refrigeration systems required massive amounts of power, meaning the ships would burn fuel constantly just to avoid melting. The construction process was incredibly slow, taking much longer than building traditional steel carriers. Worse yet, the war was moving faster than ice ship development. By 1943, the Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic through other means. Conventional aircraft carriers, improved radar, and better convoy tactics were defeating German submarines without needing floating ice fortresses. The urgency that drove Project Habakkuk began fading as military priorities shifted elsewhere. Then there was the practical issue of crew comfort. Living aboard an ice ship meant constant cold and humidity. Condensation would freeze on every metal surface. The crew would need special heating systems just to survive their own vessel. Even with insulation, working conditions would be brutal compared to steel ships. The final nail came when engineers calculated the true costs. Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko shifted position, knowing enemy snipers were hunting for her muzzle flash. This was just another day at the office for the woman who would become known as Lady Death. Most people think World War II snipers were always men hiding in trenches. Wrong. The Soviet Union produced some of the deadliest female marksmen in history, and Pavlyuchenko topped them all. She wasn't some propaganda poster girl either. This woman could outshoot almost anyone on the battlefield. Before the war, Lyudmila was a history student at Kiev University. Pretty normal life, right? She worked at an arsenal factory and practiced shooting at a local club. Nothing screamed future legendary sniper. But when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, everything changed fast. Pavlyuchenko tried to enlist as a nurse. The recruitment officers took one look at her and basically said, "Thanks, but we need you for bandages, not bullets." She wasn't having it. Lyudmila pulled out her shooting club certificates and marksmanship awards. The officers changed their tune real quick. Her first assignment was defending Odessa. Most new snipers get nervous about their first kill. Takes time to adjust to the reality of war. Not Pavlyuchenko. Her first 2 kills happened on the same day. She adapted to combat like she'd been doing it for years. The German siege of Sevastopol turned into her hunting ground. This wasn't some Hollywood movie where she magically never missed. Real sniping meant patience, calculation, and surviving return fire. Pavlyuchenko spent hours lying motionless in destroyed buildings waiting for the perfect shot. Enemy snipers specifically targeted her. The Germans knew Soviet women were operating rifles on the front lines, and it frustrated them. Some German commanders put bounties on female snipers, treating them like special prizes. Pavlyuchenko had multiple close calls where bullets whizzed past her head. Her kill count kept climbing. 50 confirmed kills, then 100. Each confirmation required witnesses or physical evidence. The Soviet military didn't hand out these numbers casually. Every single kill had to be verified by officers or fellow soldiers. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect. German troops started hearing stories about Soviet women picking them off from impossible distances. Imagine being a 19-year-old German soldier and learning that grandmothers and college students were outgunning your best marksman. That messes with your head. Pavlyuchenko's reputation spread beyond the battlefield. Soviet newspapers started covering her exploits. Radio broadcasts mentioned her achievements. The government realized they had a propaganda goldmine on their hands. But here's the thing, she kept fighting while becoming famous. By the time she was wounded and evacuated from Sevastopol, her official count reached 309 confirmed kills. That number included 36 enemy snipers. Think about that for a second. She wasn't just shooting regular infantry. Pavlyuchenko was hunting other professional killers and winning those duels. The Soviet government pulled her from combat duty. Too valuable to risk losing, they said. Pavlyuchenko got sent on a publicity tour to the United States and Britain. She met Eleanor Roosevelt and spoke at rallies. American crowds expected some delicate flower in uniform. Instead, they got a tough-talking veteran who'd seen real combat. Her American tour created some awkward moments. Reporters kept asking about her lipstick and hair instead of her military service. Pavlyuchenko got annoyed fast. She'd survived months of German artillery and sniper duels, and journalists wanted to know about her beauty routine. During one American press conference, she delivered a line that became legendary. "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The room went quiet. But beyond the publicity tours and newspaper headlines, Pavlyuchenko represented something bigger. She proved that women could excel in combat roles traditionally reserved for men. Soviet female snipers weren't an experiment or publicity stunt. They were legitimate soldiers who saved lives and changed battles. The weird part is how her story almost got forgotten after the war. Cold War tensions meant Western countries didn't celebrate Soviet heroes very much. Pavlyuchenko became a footnote instead of the legend she deserved to be. Only decades later did historians properly recognize her achievements. Her legacy challenges assumptions about warfare and gender roles. While other armies debated whether women belonged in combat, the Soviets were already proving the answer on battlefields across Eastern Europe. Speaking of proving things on battlefields, the Americans had their own creative approach to confusing enemies. They discovered that sometimes the best weapon isn't a rifle or tank, but pure theatrical deception designed to fool entire German divisions into making costly mistakes. While real armies clashed with actual tanks and genuine artillery, the Americans decided to fight Hitler with something completely different: fake everything. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, turned deception into an art form. These weren't your typical soldiers charging into battle. They were artists, actors and sound engineers who wielded paintbrushes instead of rifles and carried inflatable tanks instead of ammunition. The Ghost Army's mission sounds like something from a comedy sketch. Make the Germans think massive American forces were gathering where none existed. Force enemy commanders to waste troops defending against phantom divisions, all while the real Allied armies struck somewhere else entirely. But here's the twist. It actually worked. Their toolkit read like a Hollywood prop department gone military. Inflatable Sherman tanks that could be set up by 4 men in 20 minutes. Fake artillery pieces made from rubber and wood that looked genuine from aerial reconnaissance. Sound trucks equipped with massive speakers that could broadcast the noise of tank formations, marching troops and construction work from miles away. The Germans heard what sounded like thousands of soldiers preparing for attack, but it was just a handful of guys with really good audio equipment. Then there were the radio operators. These masters of fake chatter created entire fictional command structures on the airwaves. They'd broadcast orders for non-existent regiments, coordinate supply drops for phantom battalions, and complain about imaginary equipment shortages. German intelligence officers listening in heard what seemed like legitimate military communications for massive troop buildups. In reality, it was creative writing performed over radio waves. The visual deception proved equally impressive. Artists who'd worked for advertising agencies and Hollywood studios before the war now painted camouflage and built fake installations. They'd create dummy airfields complete with plywood bombers, construct phony supply depots filled with empty crates, and even set up fake laundries and mess halls to make their phantom bases look occupied. From German reconnaissance planes flying overhead, everything appeared completely authentic. But the Ghost Army's real genius lay in the details. They didn't just place fake tanks in fields and call it a day. They created tire tracks leading to and from their rubber vehicles. They hung laundry near fake camps. They even had soldiers walk around their decoy positions wearing different unit patches, so any German spies would report seeing multiple divisions instead of one small special unit. Their first major operation targeted the Germans during the breakout from Normandy. While the real 9th Armored Division moved secretly toward the actual attack point, the Ghost Army set up shop elsewhere with fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks and sound effects. German commanders, convinced a major assault was coming from the Ghost Army's position, kept valuable panzer reserves in place to defend against an attack that would never come. The real American armor struck with complete surprise. Operation Elephant in 1944 showcased their expanding creativity. The Ghost Army spent weeks building up fake preparations for a river crossing that existed only in their imaginations. They broadcast radio traffic about bridge-building equipment, played sounds of heavy machinery working through the night, and positioned inflatable boats along the riverbank. German artillery wasted thousands of shells bombarding empty positions while Allied forces crossed safely miles away. The psychological warfare extended beyond just fooling German intelligence. Word of mysterious American superweapons and massive secret armies began spreading through enemy ranks. Some German soldiers reported seeing tanks that appeared and disappeared overnight, hearing ghostly mechanical sounds with no visible source, and intercepting radio messages about units that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Operation Bettenberg near the Luxembourg border pushed their deception to new heights. The Ghost Army convinced German commanders that 2 full American divisions were preparing a major offensive. In reality, fewer than 1,100 men with their inflatable arsenal created the illusion of over 30,000 troops with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The Germans pulled veteran units from other fronts to counter this phantom threat, weakening their defenses where real attacks would actually occur. Throughout their campaign, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 major deception operations. They saved an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives by drawing German attention and resources away from genuine military objectives. Their success rate was remarkable. German intelligence files captured after the war showed they'd been fooled repeatedly by the same inflatable tanks and recorded sound effects. The unit operated under such secrecy that their existence remained classified for decades after the war ended. Veterans couldn't discuss their service, leading to awkward conversations when people asked what they'd done during the war. Fighting Hitler with art supplies and theater props didn't sound like conventional military service, but it proved just as deadly effective as any traditional weapon. While the Ghost Army perfected their deceptions in Europe, on the other side of the world, Japanese pilots were preparing for missions where deception played no role whatsoever, suicide attacks that would become known by a name meaning divine wind. The Ghost Army's inflatable tanks might have fooled the Germans, but Japan had something far more terrifying in mind. While Americans were busy creating fake warfare, Japanese pilots were preparing for the ultimate sacrifice. Their planes weren't decoys, they were flying bombs with human guidance systems. Kamikaze attacks began in October 1944 when Japan realized conventional tactics weren't working. The name itself means divine wind, referencing ancient storms that supposedly protected Japan from Mongol invasions centuries earlier. Japanese commanders figured, if nature could save them once, maybe desperate pilots could do it again. They were betting everything on young men willing to die for their country. The math was brutal but simple. One pilot, one plane, one chance to sink an entire warship carrying hundreds of enemy sailors. From Japan's perspective, it seemed like a fair trade. A single kamikaze could potentially eliminate more enemy personnel than entire squadrons of conventional fighters. The economics of desperation, you might say, training these suicide pilots was surprisingly complex. They didn't just hand someone a plane and point them toward American ships. Pilots learned specific approach angles, optimal diving speeds, and which parts of enemy vessels caused maximum damage. Some received only basic flying lessons since advanced maneuvers weren't necessary. After all, landing wasn't part of the curriculum, but here's where it gets personal. Many kamikaze pilots were barely out of their teens. College students, farm boys, young men who'd never been far from home suddenly found themselves preparing farewell letters to families they'd never see again. These weren't seasoned warriors drunk on battle glory. They were kids scared out of their minds, following orders in a culture where refusing meant dishonoring everyone they loved. The letters they wrote are heartbreaking. One pilot told his parents he was happy to die for the emperor but asked them to take care of his pet rabbit. Another wrote detailed instructions about his girlfriend's favorite flowers, hoping someone would bring them to her grave after the war. These weren't mindless fanatics, they were terrified young men trying to find meaning in suicide. American sailors quickly learned to fear the sound of approaching Japanese planes. Unlike regular bombing runs, kamikaze attacks gave almost no warning. Conventional pilots would drop their payload and flee. Kamikaze pilots kept coming no matter how much anti-aircraft fire they faced. Ship's gunners could riddle a plane with bullets, but if the pilot remained conscious for just a few more seconds, impact was inevitable. The psychological warfare was devastating. Imagine being a 19-year-old American sailor watching Japanese planes dive straight at your ship with no intention of pulling up. Regular combat has rules, patterns, predictable behaviors. Kamikaze attacks threw all that out the window. How do you mentally prepare for enemies who want to die while killing you? Japanese engineers modified planes specifically for suicide missions. They removed unnecessary equipment, stripped out armor plating and loaded aircraft with extra explosives. Some planes carried over 500 pounds of bombs in addition to fuel that would ignite on impact. The aircraft became flying grenades guided by human intelligence. Then there's the success rate, which was surprisingly low. Only about 19% of kamikaze attacks actually hit their targets. Most pilots were shot down before reaching American ships, crashed into the ocean, or missed entirely due to inexperience or battle damage. Still, when they did connect, the results were catastrophic. The US's Bunker Hill lost 346 sailors in just 30 seconds when two kamikaze planes struck within minutes of each other. The USS Indianapolis, famous for delivering atomic bomb components, survived kamikaze attacks only to be sunk later by a submarine, but other ships weren't so lucky. Over the course of the war, kamikaze attacks sank or damaged hundreds of Allied vessels. American forces developed countermeasures. They positioned destroyer pickets far from main fleets to provide early warning. Fighter patrols increased dramatically. Anti-aircraft guns were upgraded and multiplied. Some ships even used balloons trailing cables to snare low-flying attackers. Yet nothing could completely stop a determined pilot willing to die. The strangest part? Some kamikaze pilots survived. Mechanical failures, weather problems, or being shot down over water meant a few lived through missions designed to kill them. These survivors faced terrible shame in Japanese culture. They'd failed at failing, if that makes sense. Many attempted multiple suicide missions before finally succeeding in dying. As Japan's situation became more desperate, kamikaze attacks intensified. During the Battle of Okinawa, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched in just 3 months. The strategy had evolved from last resort to primary tactic. Japanese commanders were literally throwing away their remaining pilots in hope of stopping American advances. But while Japanese pilots were perfecting the art of aerial suicide, Allied forces were developing their own underground surprises. Deep beneath the Rock of Gibraltar, British engineers were carving out one of the war's most secret hideouts. Deep beneath the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar, something extraordinary was taking shape in 1941. British engineers weren't just reinforcing their defenses, they were preparing for the unthinkable. What if Nazi forces captured the Rock of Gibraltar? What if this crucial gateway between the Atlantic and Mediterranean fell into enemy hands? The answer involved 6 brave men and a cave that would become one of history's most bizarre wartime hideouts. Gibraltar represented everything to the British war effort. Ships passed through these waters daily, carrying supplies that kept Britain alive during the darkest days of the war. Lose Gibraltar, and Hitler would control the Mediterranean like his personal swimming pool. German U-boats would have a field day hunting Allied vessels. The strategic importance couldn't be overstated. This tiny peninsula held the power to shift the entire war. But the British had a backup plan that sounds like something from a spy novel. They carved out a secret cave deep within the rock itself. Not just any cave, mind you. This underground fortress was designed to house 6 specially selected men who would continue intelligence operations even after Gibraltar fell to the Nazis. These weren't your average soldiers either. Each man was chosen for specific skills: radio operators, intelligence analysts and reconnaissance experts who could keep Allied command informed about enemy movements. The preparation phase reveals just how seriously the British took this contingency. Engineers worked around the clock, hollowing out enough space for a 7-year stay. 7 years, they weren't planning a quick weekend camping trip. The cave received ventilation systems, communication equipment, and enough supplies to outlast a presidential term. Food rations, medical supplies, weapons, ammunition, everything needed for an extended underground war. Then there's the sheer audacity of expecting 6 men to remain hidden for potentially 7 years while Nazis occupied the territory above their heads. The psychological pressure alone would have been crushing. These men would listen to German boots marching overhead, knowing that discovery meant certain death. No backup was coming, no rescue missions were planned, they were ghosts before they even entered the cave. The technical challenges were staggering too. How do you maintain radio contact with London from deep underground without Nazi detection equipment picking up the signals? The British solved this with ingenious antenna systems and signal relay methods that could operate undetected. They even planned for equipment failures and replacement schedules that would keep communications running for years. What makes this story even stranger is how close it came to reality. German plans for Operation Felix aimed to capture Gibraltar with Spanish cooperation. Hitler himself recognized the strategic value and pressed Franco to join the assault. Franco, playing his cards carefully, kept making excuses and delaying. Had Spain joined the Axis powers fully, those 6 men might have found themselves sealed into their limestone tomb, beginning a 7-year underground vigil. The selection process for these cave dwellers must have been intense. What kind of person volunteers to potentially spend 7 years buried alive in a cave? Military records suggest they looked for men with exceptional mental resilience, technical skills and the ability to work in extremely confined spaces without losing their sanity. The psychological profiles alone would make fascinating reading. As the war progressed and the threat to Gibraltar diminished, the cave plan became unnecessary. Allied victories in North Africa and Italy reduced the likelihood of a successful German assault on the rock. The 6 chosen men probably breathed sighs of relief as they learned their underground mission was cancelled. The cave was sealed, its entrance hidden, and the whole operation classified at the highest levels. For over 50 years, this incredible backup plan remained one of Britain's best-kept secrets. The cave sat empty, a time capsule of desperate wartime planning. Dust settled on the carefully arranged supplies. The communication equipment fell silent. Even the engineers who built it moved on to other projects, taking their secrets with them. The rediscovery in 1997 sent shockwaves through military historians. Here was physical proof of just how far the British were willing to go to maintain their intelligence networks. The preserved supplies, still neatly arranged after decades, told a story of meticulous planning and incredible dedication. Maps remained pinned to walls, radio equipment sat ready for use, and sleeping quarters waited for occupants who never came. This hidden cave represents something profound about wartime desperation and ingenuity. When facing potential annihilation, Humans devised the most extraordinary survival strategies. The British weren't content to simply defend Gibraltar, they planned to haunt it as ghosts in the machine, feeding intelligence to London even from beyond the grave of military defeat. While Gibraltar's defenders prepared for underground warfare, other Allied forces were getting creative with their own deception tactics. Sometimes the best way to fool the enemy isn't hiding in caves, but hiding the truth in plain sight. The British had a problem during World War II. How do you crush enemy morale when your bombs keep missing their targets? Well, someone in London came up with a brilliantly twisted solution. Why not let the Germans deliver your propaganda for you? Operation Cornflakes sounds like a breakfast cereal marketing campaign, but it was actually one of the war's most devious psychological operations. The plan was simple in concept but diabolical in execution. British intelligence would wait for their bombers to attack German mail trains, then quickly drop bags of fake letters near the wreckage. When German postal workers arrived to salvage what they could, they'd scoop up the phony mail along with the real stuff. The beauty of this scheme, German efficiency would work against them. Their postal service was so reliable that they'd unknowingly deliver enemy propaganda straight to people's doorsteps. Talk about special delivery. Creating convincing fake mail required serious attention to detail. British forgers studied captured German letters for months, learning everything from regional dialects to the specific types of paper used in different cities. They even analyzed ink samples and postmark styles. One small mistake could blow the entire operation. The fake letters weren't random either. Each one was carefully crafted to spread specific types of bad news. Some contained fabricated reports about military defeats that German newspapers weren't allowed to print. Others described food shortages in areas where rationing hadn't been announced yet. A few even included gossip about Nazi officials supposedly living in luxury while ordinary Germans suffered. Then there were the really clever ones. Some letters appeared to be from German soldiers writing home from the front lines, describing terrible conditions and questioning why they were fighting. These were particularly effective because they seemed authentic and personal. Who would suspect their postal worker of being an unwitting British spy? The operation required split-second timing. Bomber crews had to coordinate with intelligence officers on the ground. After attacking a mail train, they'd circle back and drop the fake mail bags within hours. Any longer, and German authorities might secure the crash site too thoroughly for the deception to work. German postal workers, dedicated to their jobs even during wartime, would arrive at bombed trains and gather up scattered mail. They couldn't tell the difference between real letters that had been blown around by explosives and fake ones that had been carefully scattered by British agents. Everything got sorted and sent along normal delivery routes. The psychological impact was exactly what the British hoped for. German civilians would receive letters containing disturbing information that contradicted official Nazi propaganda. Since the mail came through normal channels, people assumed it was legitimate. Doubt began spreading through neighborhoods like a slow-acting poison. Nazi authorities eventually caught on to the scheme, but by then the damage was done. Thousands of fake letters had been delivered across Germany. Even after German postal workers were warned to watch for suspicious mail, they couldn't easily spot the forgeries. The British had become too good at copying German postal techniques. What made Operation Cornflakes particularly frustrating for the Germans was its efficiency. Every bombed mail train became an opportunity for the British to inject more propaganda into the German information system. The Nazis couldn't stop mail delivery entirely without crippling their own communications network. They were trapped by their own infrastructure. Some fake letters were designed to create specific reactions. A few contained information about supposed Allied secret weapons, causing panic in certain regions. Others described fictional uprisings in German cities, making authorities waste resources investigating non-existent threats. The British were essentially weaponizing gossip and rumor. The operation also demonstrated how psychological warfare could be just as damaging as bombs and bullets. While massive air raids destroyed buildings and killed people, Operation Cornflakes attacked something more subtle but equally important: public confidence in the Nazi regime. Every fake letter planted seeds of doubt in German minds. German counterintelligence tried desperately to identify and stop the fake mail, but they faced an impossible task. With millions of legitimate letters moving through the postal system daily, finding the phonies was like searching for needles in haystacks. The British had turned Germany's own efficiency against itself. By war's end, Operation Cornflakes had delivered thousands of pieces of propaganda directly to German homes. The exact impact remains difficult to measure, but intelligence reports suggested the fake letters contributed to declining civilian morale in several regions. Sometimes the most effective weapons don't explode. The operation revealed something important about wartime psychology. People were more likely to believe bad news when it arrived through familiar, trusted channels. A propaganda leaflet dropped from a plane looked suspicious, but a letter delivered by the regular postman seemed legitimate. While the British were busy turning mail delivery into psychological warfare, other Allied forces were developing equally unusual tactics involving some very unexpected recruits. The next chapter in this strange war would literally take flight with creatures that seemed more suited for fairy tales than military operations. When British intelligence officer Stanley Lovell received orders to develop unconventional weapons in 1942, he probably didn't expect to become the world's first military animal recruiter. The Americans were desperate for new ways to attack Japan without losing more soldiers. Traditional bombing runs cost lives and planes. What if the solution wasn't bigger bombs or faster planes but tiny creatures that could sneak into enemy territory undetected? The Bat Bomb project started with a simple observation. Bats naturally roost in dark spaces during the day. Japanese cities were filled with wooden buildings with perfect hiding spots. A dentist named Lytle Adams convinced the military that bats could carry small incendiary devices into these buildings, then explode simultaneously across entire neighborhoods. The plan seemed brilliant on paper. American scientists began capturing millions of Mexican free-tail bats from caves in Texas and New Mexico. These bats weighed about half an ounce each, perfect for carrying tiny 1-ounce bombs. Engineers designed special capsules that would be dropped from planes at dawn. Each capsule contained 40 compartments, and each compartment held 10 bats. That's 400 flying fire starters per capsule. The bats received surgical modifications that sound like something from a mad scientist's laboratory. Researchers attached small napalm devices to each bat using string and clips. The bombs had timer fuses set to ignite after the bats found roosting spots. Military planners calculated that a single mission could release over 1 million bat bombers across Japanese cities. No air defenses existed against such tiny infiltrators. Testing began at a remote base in New Mexico, but the first trial nearly ended the entire project. Several armed bats escaped during a practice run and immediately flew to the nearest buildings, which happened to be the American test facility itself. The bats roosted under the base hangars and barracks exactly as designed. When their timers activated, multiple buildings burst into flames. Panicked soldiers watched their own base burn while the enemy bats had already flown away. Well, that wasn't the only animal recruitment drive during the war. The Office of Strategic Services, America's predecessor to the CIA, launched Project Pigeon around the same time. This operation trained pigeons to guide missiles toward enemy ships by pecking at target images. Psychologist B.F. Skinner developed the training program, teaching birds to recognize silhouettes of Japanese vessels. The pigeons would ride inside the missile nose cone, pecking at screens to steer the weapon toward its target. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were already using military animals with mixed results. Their anti-tank dogs had been exploding German vehicles since 1941, though many dogs got confused and ran toward Soviet tanks instead. The Russians also trained SEALs to plant mines on enemy submarines in Arctic waters. These marine mammals could dive deeper and stay underwater longer than human divers. British intelligence wasn't about to be outdone in creative animal warfare. They developed exploding rats, disguised as dead rodents but packed with plastic explosives. The idea was simple. German workers would discover the dead rats and throw them into factory boilers, causing massive explosions. Though Germans intercepted the first shipment, the psychological effect was enormous. Nazi forces wasted countless hours searching for more explosive vermin. Let's not forget the strangest recruit of all, Milos. American researchers seriously considered weaponizing cats. The theory suggested that cats naturally hate water and would avoid it at all costs. Scientists proposed dropping cats onto enemy ships, assuming the terrified animals would guide attached bombs away from the ocean and directly toward the vessels. The plan fell apart when researchers realized cats might just hide in the darkest corner available rather than steering anywhere useful. Back to those bat bombers though. After the New Mexico incident, military officials moved testing to a more remote location in Utah. The bats performed exactly as predicted, roosting in building crevices and setting structures ablaze with remarkable efficiency. A successful test demonstrated that bat bombs could potentially destroy entire city blocks using creatures that weighed less than a candy bar. But the atomic bomb program was advancing faster than anyone expected. By 1944, American scientists knew they possessed a weapon that could level entire cities without requiring millions of bats. The Manhattan Project offered a quicker path to ending the war, even if it lacked the creative appeal of flying mammals carrying tiny explosives. The Bat Bomb project officially ended in 1944, after consuming over $2 million and countless hours of military research. Thousands of bats had been captured, modified and trained for missions they would never fly. Some survived and returned to their cave homes, probably with interesting stories to tell other bats about their brief military service. These animal warfare experiments reveal how desperate and creative militaries became during history's most devastating conflict. When conventional weapons weren't enough, commanders turned to nature's smallest soldiers. Sometimes the wildest ideas came closest to changing everything. Speaking of wild wartime creativity, military leaders weren't finished with unusual tactics. Some turned to an even more surprising source of strategic deception: professional magicians who could make entire armies disappear. War brings out humanity's strangest ideas, but few were as bizarre as turning stage magic into battlefield strategy. When Major Jasper Maskelyne volunteered for military service, the British Army didn't quite know what to do with him. Here was a man whose entire career revolved around sawing women in half and making rabbits appear from top hats. What possible use could a magician have in the deadliest conflict in human history? Maskelyne came from a legendary family of illusionists. His grandfather and father had amazed Victorian audiences with impossible feats. But World War II demanded a different kind of impossible. The Major found himself assigned to North Africa, where General Montgomery desperately needed every advantage against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Desert warfare meant wide open spaces with nowhere to hide massive armies and equipment, or so everyone thought. The magician had other plans. He started with small tricks that made military commanders scratch their heads. Maskelyne could make a tank vanish in broad daylight using nothing more than mirrors and painted canvas. The principle was simple: redirect the eye's attention while hiding what you don't want seen. But applying this to actual warfare, that required genuine genius. His first major success involved making the entire port of Alexandria disappear. German bombers had been hammering the strategic harbor non-stop, guided by its distinctive layout. Maskelyne created a fake Alexandria 20 miles away using plywood buildings, fake anti-aircraft guns and elaborate lighting systems. The decoy even included actors playing the roles of dock workers and sailors. Meanwhile, the real Alexandria went dark, its true features masked by an intricate system of painted screens and false structures. German pilots began bombing empty sand dunes while the real ships unloaded supplies in safety. The deception worked so well that even some British personnel got confused about which Alexandria was real. Maskelyne's magical misdirection had turned one of war's most fundamental challenges, protecting vital infrastructure, into a giant shell game. But the magician wasn't finished. His most ambitious project came during preparations for the Battle of El Alamein, where Montgomery planned to break through German defensive lines. The problem was classic military strategy. How do you achieve surprise when your enemy can see your every move across miles of open desert? Maskelyne proposed something that sounded completely insane. He would make Montgomery's entire army disappear, then make it reappear somewhere else entirely. The British High Command was desperate enough to let him try. What happened next pushed the boundaries between illusion and reality. The magician's team built hundreds of fake tanks using inflatable rubber and lightweight frames. From a distance they looked identical to real armor. These decoys were positioned exactly where German reconnaissance expected to find British forces. Meanwhile, the actual tanks were disguised as supply trucks using collapsible wooden frames and canvas covers. German observers saw what appeared to be a massive armored buildup in the south, while noting only routine supply activity in the north. Timing was everything. For weeks the fake Southern Army grew larger and more threatening. German intelligence reports described endless columns of British armor massing for an obvious assault. Rommel shifted his best divisions to meet this phantom threat. On the night before battle, Maskelyne's crews worked frantically to complete the greatest vanishing act in military history. As dawn broke on October 23, 1942, Montgomery's real tanks attacked from the north, while the fake army in the south simply melted away. German forces found themselves fighting shadows while the actual British assault hit where they least expected. The element of surprise, achieved through pure theatrical deception, helped turn the tide of the entire North African campaign. The weird part is how Maskelyne's methods influenced modern warfare. Military camouflage experts studied his techniques for decades afterward. The idea of using elaborate deception operations became standard practice for intelligence agencies worldwide. Magic tricks designed to fool theater audiences had evolved into strategic weapons capable of changing history. Maskelyne's desert illusions proved that war's strangest weapons weren't always guns or bombs. Sometimes the most powerful tool was simply making your enemy see what you wanted them to see rather than what was actually there. The magician had taken his grandfather's stage tricks and scaled them up to fool entire armies. But even as magical deceptions fooled German forces in North Africa, another kind of suffering was unfolding in Eastern Europe. While Maskelyne made armies disappear in the desert, real people were disappearing behind Nazi siege lines, facing a different kind of impossible situation where survival itself became the ultimate magic trick. Winter arrived early in Leningrad during 1941, but it wasn't just the cold that would kill people. The Nazi army had surrounded the entire city like a giant steel noose, cutting off every road, every railway, every possible escape route. What followed became one of the most brutal sieges in human history, 872 days of starvation, desperation and death. The Germans had a simple plan: starve the city into submission. No food goes in, no people come out. Wait long enough, and Leningrad would surrender without firing another shot. Makes sense on paper, right? Well, nobody told the people of Leningrad they were supposed to give up. By October 1941, the city's food reserves were almost gone. Warehouses that once held tons of grain and meat now echoed empty. The government had to make impossible decisions about rationing. Workers got 250 grams of bread per day. Everyone else, just 125 grams. That's roughly 2 thin slices per day. Your entire food allowance. But calling it bread was being generous. Bakers mixed sawdust, wallpaper paste and cotton seed cake into the dough just to make it bigger. Sometimes the bread contained more wood pulp than actual flour. People chewed on leather belts, boiled grass from parks and scraped paste off wallpaper to eat. The paste contained potato starch, which provided a few precious calories. Then there were the rats. In normal times, people would set traps to get rid of them. During the siege, catching a rat meant dinner for the whole family. Pet cats and dogs disappeared from the streets first, then pigeons vanished from the squares. Finally, even the rats became scarce because people had eaten most of them too. The WW2 warehouses, which stored most of the city's food reserves, caught fire during an early bombing raid. Residents later discovered that the melted sugar had soaked into the ground. They dug up the dirt and sold it on the black market. Sugar-flavored soil became a delicacy. Let that sink in for a moment. Winter made everything worse. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The city's heating system failed because there was no fuel. Water pipes froze solid. Electricity became sporadic, then stopped altogether in many neighborhoods. Families burned furniture, books, and picture frames just to stay warm for a few hours. People started dying in massive numbers. Not from bombs or bullets, but from hunger. Bodies appeared on street corners, in apartment hallways, and in public squares. The city organized collection teams to gather corpses, but sometimes the collectors themselves collapsed from starvation before finishing their routes. Mass graves couldn't be dug fast enough, because the ground was frozen solid. The weird part is how normal life tried to continue. Schools stayed open, even when teachers were fainting from hunger. The famous Mariinsky Theater kept performing operas and ballets. Musicians played concerts by candlelight, while wearing winter coats, because there was no heating. One violinist reportedly collapsed during a performance, but insisted on finishing the piece before being carried off stage. Some families made horrifying choices that nobody should ever have to make. Parents gave their food rations to children, slowly starving themselves to keep their kids alive a few days longer. Others hoarded their meager portions, watching family members waste away. There were whispers of cannibalism, though people rarely spoke about it directly. Desperation makes humans capable of unthinkable things. The only lifeline was the road of life, across frozen Lake Ladoga. Trucks drove across the ice carrying supplies, but it was incredibly dangerous. The ice could crack without warning, sending entire convoys to the bottom. German planes bombed the route constantly. Many drivers made the journey knowing they probably wouldn't return. Yet somehow, incredibly, the city refused to surrender. Factory workers continued building weapons even while collapsing from hunger. Radio broadcasts kept playing music and news updates. The hammer and sickle flag still flew over government buildings. Hitler expected Leningrad to fall within weeks. Instead, the siege dragged on for nearly 2.5 years. By the time Soviet forces finally broke the blockade in January 1944, over 1 million people had died. Most perished from starvation and disease rather than enemy action. Entire families were found frozen in their apartments, having died quietly in their sleep. Some left notes apologizing to neighbors for any inconvenience their deaths might cause. The survivors looked like walking skeletons. Many weighed less than 80 pounds. Children had forgotten what candy tasted like. Adults couldn't remember the last time they felt truly full after a meal. Some developed a condition called siege psychosis, where they continued hoarding food for years after the war ended, terrified of ever being hungry again. But while Leningrad's people were eating sawdust bread and wallpaper paste, Allied intelligence officers were cooking up an elaborate deception involving a dead body and fake military plans that would fool the entire German high command. Picture yourself as a British intelligence officer in 1943, staring at a problem that could cost thousands of Allied lives. Everyone knows the Allies are planning to invade somewhere in the Mediterranean. The Germans expect it. But where? Sicily seems like the obvious choice, which makes it incredibly dangerous. The Nazis have fortified it heavily, waiting for the attack they know is coming. Then someone in the room suggests the most bizarre solution imaginable. What if we convince the Germans we're attacking somewhere else entirely? Not with fake radio signals or dummy tanks, but with a dead body carrying false invasion plans. The British intelligence officers weren't joking. They actually went ahead with this insane idea, creating one of the most successful deceptions in military history. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and it sounds like something from a spy novel that's too ridiculous to be real. First, they needed a corpse. Can't exactly post a job listing for that. The team found the body of a homeless man who had died from rat poison, though they never revealed his real identity. Poor guy probably never imagined he'd become a war hero after death. They gave him a new identity, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. Creating a believable person from a dead stranger required incredible attention to detail. Major Martin needed a personality, a history, and most importantly, a reason for carrying top-secret documents. The intelligence team crafted an entire fictional life for him. They gave him a fiancée named Pam, complete with love letters and a photograph. They put theater ticket stubs in his pockets, bills from his tailor, and even a stern letter from his bank about his overdraft. The fake major also got a heartbreaking farewell letter from his father and an angry note from his club about unpaid bills. These weren't just random papers thrown together. Every single item was designed to make Major Martin feel real to anyone who examined his belongings. The Germans would need to believe this was an actual British officer, not some elaborate hoax. But here's where it gets really clever. The fake invasion plans weren't obviously labeled "Top Secret Invasion Plans Do Not Read." That would be suspiciously convenient. Instead, Major Martin carried what appeared to be personal letters between high-ranking British officers. One letter casually mentioned that the Allies were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia, using Sicily as a diversion to fool the Germans. The psychology behind this was brilliant. If you find someone's private correspondence, you assume it contains the truth. People lie in official reports, but they're honest in personal letters to friends. The British were counting on the Germans thinking exactly that way. Getting Major Martin to the right place required careful planning. They couldn't just dump a body on a German beach. That would look suspicious. Instead, a British submarine carried the corpse to the coast of Spain, a neutral country where German spies operated freely. The plan was for Spanish authorities to find the body, examine his documents, and inevitably share the information with their German contacts. The submarine crew released Major Martin's body off the Spanish coast, complete with an inflated life jacket to make it look like he'd survived a plane crash before drowning. Spanish fishermen found the body and turned it over to local authorities, exactly as the British had hoped. Spanish officials examined Major Martin's documents before returning them to the British, but not before German agents had photographed everything. The fake letters made their way up the German chain of command, eventually reaching Hitler himself. The Führer was completely convinced by the deception. German forces immediately began repositioning based on the false intelligence. They moved troops away from Sicily toward Greece and Sardinia, exactly where Major Martin's documents said the real invasions would happen. Entire divisions shifted positions because of letters carried by a dead homeless man given a fake identity. When the Allies actually invaded Sicily in July 1943, they faced much lighter resistance than expected. The Germans had fallen completely for the deception, leaving Sicily vulnerable while they prepared to defend locations that were never going to be attacked. Operation Mincemeat saved thousands of Allied lives by convincing the enemy to look the wrong way at the crucial moment. The success was so complete that even after the Sicily invasion began, some German commanders still believed it was the diversion mentioned in Major Martin's papers. They kept waiting for the real invasion of Greece that was never coming. Years later, when the operation was declassified, the world learned the incredible truth about Major Martin. The homeless man, whose identity remains unknown, had posthumously become one of the war's most successful spies. His fake love letters and unpaid bills had fooled an entire army. While the British were perfecting the art of deception with dead bodies and fake documents, the Soviets were taking a completely different approach to unconventional warfare. They had discovered that sometimes the most effective weapons came from the most unexpected places. When most people think of World War II weapons, they picture machine guns, tanks, and artillery. But for millions of Soviet soldiers, their most trusted companion wasn't some high-tech piece of equipment. It was a simple tool you'd find in any garden shed: the shovel. The standard Soviet entrenching tool became legendary on the Eastern Front. About 2 feet long with a sharpened edge, it looked innocent enough. Don't let that fool you. In the hands of a desperate soldier, this thing turned into one of the war's most feared close combat weapons. Soviet training manuals actually included entire chapters on shovel fighting techniques. They taught soldiers how to thrust, slash, and block with these tools. The edge could be sharpened to razor quality, making it deadly effective in trench warfare. One manual described 17 different attack positions using just a shovel. 17, that's more techniques than some soldiers learned for their rifles. Why did shovels become so important? The Eastern Front was brutal beyond imagination. When ammunition ran low and bayonets broke, soldiers grabbed whatever they could find. The shovel was always there, sturdy and reliable. Plus, every soldier carried one anyway for digging trenches and foxholes. Then there's the psychological factor. Getting attacked by someone wielding a shovel felt personal, almost insulting. German soldiers reported being genuinely terrified of Soviet troops charging with these tools. There's something primal about facing someone swinging what looks like a farming implement, but cuts like a sword. The Soviets weren't just making this up as they went along either. They studied traditional Russian martial arts that used similar tools. Peasants had been defending themselves with farm equipment for centuries. The military just formalized these techniques and added them to official training. Combat reports from Stalingrad mention entire squads of Soviet soldiers armed primarily with sharpened shovels. When fighting moved into buildings and sewers, these tools proved more useful than rifles. You could swing a shovel in tight spaces where a rifle with bayonet would get caught on walls or debris. One German officer wrote in his diary about a night raid where Soviet soldiers appeared like ghosts with shovels. The attack was so unexpected and brutal that his entire unit retreated in panic. The Soviets had managed to infiltrate their position and eliminate sentries using only these tools, completely silent. But here's where it gets really interesting. The shovel wasn't just a weapon of desperation. Soviet engineers actually improved the design specifically for combat. They reinforced the handle, perfected the weight distribution, and created different blade shapes for different purposes. Some had serrated edges, others were designed more like small axes. The training was surprisingly sophisticated too. Soldiers learned to use the shovel's flat side for blocking, the point for thrusting, and the edge for cutting. They practiced combinations that flowed from digging positions into attack stances. A soldier could be quietly digging a foxhole one moment, then instantly ready for hand-to-hand combat the next. German intelligence reports from 1943 specifically warned about Soviet shovel fighters. They noted that these soldiers were often more dangerous in close quarters than those with traditional weapons. The shovel fighters had developed an almost supernatural ability to appear from nowhere, strike quickly, and disappear back into their trenches. What makes this even more remarkable is how the story spread. Other Allied forces heard about Soviet shovel tactics and started experimenting themselves. American paratroopers tried similar techniques, though never to the same extent. The British included shovel combat in some commando training programs. The Eastern Front's conditions made shovels particularly effective. Frozen ground meant soldiers spent enormous amounts of time digging. Their hands developed calluses perfectly shaped for gripping these tools. When combat erupted, the transition felt natural, almost instinctive. Soviet propaganda eventually caught on to this phenomenon. Posters showed heroic soldiers wielding shovels alongside rifles and grenades. The message was clear: every tool could serve the motherland, even the humblest ones. This wasn't just about weapons, it was about resourcefulness and determination. By war's end, captured German soldiers reported that facing Soviet shovel fighters was among their worst combat experiences. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't professional killers with expensive equipment. They were ordinary people who'd turned everyday tools into instruments of war. The shovel became a symbol of Soviet resilience. When everything else failed, when supplies ran out and equipment broke down, soldiers could still fight with whatever they had. It represented the kind of desperate innovation that kept the Red Army moving toward Berlin. While Americans were developing advanced radar systems and Germans were building jet engines, Soviet soldiers were perfecting the ancient art of close-quarters combat with gardening tools. Sometimes the simplest solutions prove most effective, but speaking of transportation, the Allies were about to launch one of the war's most impressive logistical operations, moving supplies across France at breakneck speed. While Soviet soldiers were sharpening their shovels for battle, another crucial fight was happening behind the scenes. After D-Day, Allied forces were pushing deep into France, but they faced a massive problem. How do you keep hundreds of thousands of troops supplied when they're racing across enemy territory? The answer came in the form of the most incredible trucking operation in military history. The Red Ball Express wasn't just any supply line. This was a 24-hour convoy system that would make modern logistics companies weep with envy. Starting in August 1944, over 900 trucks began running non-stop between Normandy beaches and the front lines. These weren't gentle Sunday drives either. Drivers had to navigate bombed-out roads, dodge enemy aircraft, and maintain breakneck speeds while carrying everything from fuel to ammunition to medical supplies. But here's where things get interesting. The majority of these drivers were African American soldiers who had been denied combat roles due to military segregation policies. Well, turns out they got plenty of combat anyway. German planes regularly strafed the convoys, and drivers found themselves racing through active battlefields, so much for keeping them away from the action. The operation got its name from railroad terminology, where Red Bull freight meant highest priority cargo. These trucks carried that Red Bull symbol like a badge of honor. Priority meant life or death for advancing troops, especially General Patton's Third Army, which was burning through fuel and ammunition at an insane rate. Let's talk numbers for a second. On average, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily. That's roughly equivalent to moving 400 full-sized elephants worth of gear every single day. During peak operations, they were covering over 700 miles of French roads, with trucks spaced just a few hundred yards apart, creating an endless snake of military vehicles. The drivers themselves were something else entirely. They worked in shifts around the clock, often driving for 20 hours straight. Sleep meant a quick nap in the cab before the next run. Many hadn't driven anything bigger than a family car before the war, but suddenly they were handling massive military trucks loaded with explosives through enemy territory. Then there's the maintenance nightmare nobody talks about. These trucks were running constantly over roads that had been bombed, shelled, and generally destroyed by months of warfare. Mechanics worked alongside the convoys, fixing blown tires and engine problems on the go. Some repairs happened while under enemy fire, because stopping wasn't an option. The Germans quickly figured out what these convoys meant. Disrupting supply lines became a top priority, leading to regular attacks on the Red Bull roads. Drivers had to master the art of evasive driving, while keeping their cargo intact. Imagine trying to outrun a diving fighter plane, while hauling several tons of high explosives. Makes sense why they called these guys heroes, right? Weather added another layer of complexity. Late summer 1944 brought heavy rains that turned damaged roads into mud pits. Trucks got stuck regularly, requiring coordinated efforts to keep them moving. The convoy couldn't afford delays when frontline troops were running out of ammunition. What made this operation truly remarkable was the speed of advancement it enabled. Patton's forces were moving so fast across France that traditional supply methods couldn't keep up. The Red Ball Express became the lifeline that allowed Allied forces to maintain their momentum toward Germany. Without it, the rapid advance would have ground to a halt. The racial dynamics created some unexpected situations. White and black soldiers worked side by side in ways that rarely happened elsewhere in the segregated military. Shared danger has a way of breaking down barriers, and convoy crews develop tight bonds regardless of background. Enemy bullets don't discriminate based on skin color. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had served its purpose. As Allied forces established more permanent supply lines and captured additional ports, the need for this emergency trucking operation diminished. but in those crucial months, it had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies and proved that American industrial might could support military operations anywhere. The weird part is how little recognition these drivers received at the time. These weren't military-grade communication devices or sophisticated radio equipment. They were literally children's toys, the kind you'd find at a five-and-dime store. But in the chaos of war, simple solutions often work better than complex ones. Here's how it worked. A lost paratrooper would press his clicker once, making a single click sound. If another soldier heard it, and was American, he'd respond with 2 clicks. Click, click. No response meant trouble. Wrong response meant even bigger trouble. The beauty lay in its simplicity. Even terrified, disoriented soldiers could remember this basic code under extreme stress. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions received thousands of these clickers before their jump into Normandy. Each paratrooper got one, along with strict instructions about proper use. The device had to be quiet enough to avoid detection by German patrols, yet loud enough for friendlies to hear at close range. Makes sense, right? What made this system brilliant wasn't just the technology, it was the psychology. German soldiers couldn't easily replicate the exact sound, even if they captured a clicker. The metal construction produced a very specific tone and rhythm that was nearly impossible to fake with improvised materials. Plus, the stress of combat made it difficult for enemy forces to remember and execute the correct response pattern under pressure. But the weird part is how these clickers almost didn't exist at all. Military planners initially wanted complex password systems and elaborate hand signals for nighttime identification. Combat veterans argued against this approach, knowing that confused, scared soldiers in the dark needed something foolproof. The cricket clicker won out, because it required zero language skills and worked even if a soldier was wounded or partially deaf from explosions. The night jumps proved these concerns were justified. Paratroopers landed miles from their intended drop zones, scattered across a landscape filled with hedgerows, ditches, and enemy positions. Many lost their equipment during the jump or landing. Others found themselves completely alone in hostile territory. The cricket clicker became their lifeline, the one piece of gear that could mean the difference between rescue and disaster. Then there's the production side of this story. The US military ordered tens of thousands of these toy clickers from American manufacturers, who had no idea what they were for. Factory workers thought they were making noisemakers for some kind of training exercise. The secrecy surrounding their actual purpose was so tight that even the companies producing them remained in the dark until after the war ended. During the actual D-Day operations, the clicking sounds echoed across the French countryside like a strange mechanical symphony. Paratroopers reported hearing the distinctive click-click responses through the darkness, providing immediate relief and orientation in an otherwise terrifying situation. Some soldiers said it was the most beautiful sound they'd ever heard, proof that friendly forces were nearby, and they weren't completely alone behind enemy lines. The system worked so well that other Allied units adopted similar approaches for nighttime operations. British forces developed their own variation using different sound patterns, while Canadian units experimented with modified versions of the American design. The success rate for correct identification increased dramatically compared to previous password-based systems. Not everything went perfectly though. Some paratroopers lost their clickers during the jump or accidentally broke them upon landing. Others forgot the proper sequence in the heat of battle, leading to tense standoffs between American forces who should have been working together. A few German soldiers did manage to capture clickers and attempted to use them for ambushes, though these attempts were generally unsuccessful due to their unfamiliarity with the proper timing and technique. The cricket clicker represents something important about warfare. Sometimes the simplest solutions prove most effective. While military engineers developed radar systems, code machines, and advanced weapons, a children's toy helped prevent friendly fire incidents and saved lives during one of the war's most crucial operations. Well, speaking of crucial operations and preventing disasters, the Germans had their own concerns about protecting valuable items during wartime, but their approach involved something far more elaborate than simple identification systems. They were busy orchestrating the largest art theft in human history. While Allied forces fought battles across Europe, Hitler had another obsession consuming his mind: art, not creating it, but stealing it. The Nazis launched the largest art theft in human history, looting museums, private collections, and churches across conquered territories. They weren't just grabbing random paintings either. This was systematic, organized plunder on an industrial scale. The scope was staggering. Millions of pieces disappeared from France alone. Entire museum collections vanished overnight. Private homes of Jewish families were stripped bare, their treasured artworks loaded onto trains headed for Germany. The Nazis even created special units called the Kunstschutz, supposedly to protect cultural treasures. Protection in this case meant shipping everything valuable straight to Berlin. But here's where it gets really twisted. Hitler fancied himself an artist, remember? He'd been rejected from art school twice before becoming a dictator. Now he planned to build the world's greatest art museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria. The Führer Museum would showcase his stolen collection, making him the ultimate art collector. Talk about overcompensation. The logistics were mind-boggling. Priceless paintings by Picasso, Van Gogh and Monet were crammed into railway cars like cargo. Ancient sculptures were wrapped in newspaper and tossed into trucks. Renaissance masterpieces ended up stacked in damp basements. Many pieces suffered irreparable damage during transport, but the Nazis didn't care. Quantity mattered more than preservation. Then there's Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man, who turned art theft into a personal hobby. His collection rivaled Hitler's, with over 1,400 stolen pieces decorating his various mansions. Göring would literally shop through confiscated artworks like browsing a department store. He'd point at paintings and say, "I'll take that one, and definitely that one." The man had zero shame. As the war turned against Germany, panic set in. The Nazis realized their stolen treasures might be recaptured, so they started hiding everything underground. Salt mines became their favorite storage spots because the dry conditions preserved artwork. The Oltarsee salt mine in Austria became a massive underground art warehouse, containing thousands of stolen pieces. Workers carved out special chambers, creating the world's strangest museum deep beneath the earth. Well, the Allies weren't going to let this slide. They created a special unit called the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Program. These became known as the Monuments Men, a mix of art historians, museum curators, and archaeologists turned soldiers. Their mission: track down and recover Europe's stolen cultural heritage. Armed with art history degrees instead of grenades, they raced across Europe following paper trails and Nazi clues. The search led to some incredible discoveries. In addition to the salt mines, the Nazis had stashed art in castle cellars, abandoned churches, and even subway tunnels. One mine contained over 6,500 paintings. Another had sculptures wrapped in blankets, stacked like firewood. The Monuments Men became part detective, part treasure hunter, crawling through dark tunnels with flashlights to find missing masterpieces. But the Nazis had one final nasty surprise planned. When they realized the war was lost, some officials wanted to destroy everything rather than let it be recaptured. They called it the Nero Decree. If Germany couldn't have the art, nobody could. Explosives were placed in several storage sites, ready to blow centuries of human creativity to smithereens. Fortunately, local German officials refused to carry out these destruction orders, saving countless irreplaceable works. The recovery effort revealed some shocking truths about the art world. Many dealers and collectors had willingly sold to the Nazis, knowing the pieces were stolen. Some museums quietly purchased looted artworks, asking no questions about their origins. The entire European art market had become corrupted by Nazi gold and stolen goods. After the war ended, the real work began. The Monuments Men had recovered hundreds of thousands of pieces, but returning them to rightful owners proved nearly impossible. Many original owners had died in concentration camps. Documentation was destroyed or falsified. Some countries claimed artworks that had never belonged to them originally. The sorting process took decades. And here's the frustrating part: much of the stolen art remains missing even today. Experts estimate that over 100,000 pieces are still unaccounted for. They could be hanging in private collections, gathering dust in attics, or destroyed long ago. Every few years another stolen masterpiece surfaces at an auction house or estate sale, sparking legal battles over ownership that can last for decades. The Nazis didn't just steal paintings and sculptures either. They looted everything from ancient coins to rare books, musical instruments to religious artifacts. Entire libraries disappeared. Jewish ceremonial objects were melted down for gold. The cultural destruction went far beyond what any army had attempted before. Speaking of cultural destruction, the Nazis weren't the only ones getting creative with unconventional warfare tactics. While they were busy stealing Europe's artistic heritage, Italian forces were developing their own unique approach to naval combat that would surprise everyone. While most armies fought with tanks rolling across battlefields, the Italians had a different idea entirely. Why charge at enemy ships with massive warships when you could sneak underneath them instead? The Italian Navy developed one of the most daring underwater assault tactics of the entire war. Their weapon wasn't a submarine or a torpedo in the traditional sense. It was something far stranger. The Italians called their secret weapons maiali, which literally means pigs in Italian. These weren't actual pigs, obviously, but slow-moving human torpedoes that looked remarkably pig-like when they moved through the water. 2 Italian divers would straddle these battery-powered underwater vehicles, riding them like mechanical horses straight into enemy harbors. The torpedoes moved at a crawling pace of about 3 miles per hour underwater, making the journey feel endless for the men steering them. But here's where it gets really wild. The divers weren't planning to ram their targets and blow themselves up. Instead, they'd detach a massive explosive warhead from the front of their torpedo and carefully attach it to the hull of an enemy warship. Then they'd set a timer and try to escape before the whole thing went boom. Simple in theory, absolutely terrifying in practice. The most famous attack happened in Alexandria Harbor in December 1941. 3 Italian frogmen teams rode their pigs through the heavily defended British naval base. They had to navigate past underwater nets, dodge patrol boats, and somehow avoid detection by hundreds of British sailors. The water was pitch black, and one wrong turn could mean swimming directly into a propeller or getting tangled in anti-submarine cables. Lieutenant Luigi Duran de la Penne and his partner Emilio Bianchi targeted the British battleship HMS Valiant. Their pig broke down partway through the mission, forcing them to push and drag the heavy torpedo manually through the water for hours. De la Penne's breathing apparatus failed, and he nearly drowned multiple times. Yet somehow they managed to attach their explosive charge to the battleship's hull. The British captured both men before they could escape, but de la Penne refused to reveal anything about the bomb's location or timing. The British admiral actually brought him aboard the very ship he'd just sabotaged, hoping to extract information. De la Penne sat there calmly, knowing that in a few hours, a massive explosion would rock the vessel beneath his feet. Talk about nerves of steel. When the charges finally detonated, they blew enormous holes in both HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth. Both battleships settled to the harbor bottom, putting them out of action for months. The explosions were so powerful they lifted entire sections of the ship's hulls and sent shockwaves through the water for miles. Then there's the equipment these divers used. Their breathing apparatus was primitive by today's standards, basically a closed-circuit system that recycled their exhales. If anything went wrong with the mechanism, they'd either suffocate or get poisoned by their own carbon dioxide. The diving suits offered minimal protection against the cold Mediterranean water, and hypothermia was a constant threat during long missions. The success at Alexandria wasn't their only achievement. Italian frogmen teams attacked Gibraltar multiple times, sneaking past British defenses to plant explosives on cargo ships and military vessels. Two operated from a secret base inside a fake Spanish merchant ship, hiding their pigs in specially constructed underwater compartments. British intelligence knew something was happening, but couldn't figure out how ships kept exploding in their supposedly secure harbors. What made these attacks so effective was their complete unpredictability. Naval commanders were used to threats from above the water, enemy ships, aircraft, conventional submarines. Nobody expected enemy divers to swim up from below and personally attach bombs to their hulls. It was like having someone sneak into your house through the basement while you're watching the front door. Psychological impact was huge too. British sailors started getting paranoid about every splash, every unexplained noise in the water. Harbor security became a nightmare, with patrol boats constantly dropping depth charges and searchlights sweeping the water all night long. The Italians had turned every friendly port into a source of anxiety. These human torpedo operations represented some of the earliest special forces tactics of World War II. Years before Navy SEALs or other elite underwater units became famous, Italian frogmen were proving that a small team with the right equipment could inflict damage far beyond their numbers. The courage required was extraordinary, riding a slow-moving torpedo into heavily defended enemy territory with minimal chance of escape. While Italian frogmen were revolutionizing underwater warfare with their daring pig rides, another group of military innovators was taking an entirely different approach to explain mechanical failures. Instead of blaming enemy action or equipment defects, they invented an entirely fictional enemy that somehow made perfect sense to everyone involved. Picture a World War II pilot climbing into his cockpit, checking his instruments one last time before takeoff. Everything looks perfect. The engine purrs, the controls respond smoothly, and the weather is clear. but 30 minutes into the mission, something goes wrong. The engine starts sputtering, the radio crackles with static, maybe a wing flap jams at the worst possible moment. What's a stressed-out aviator supposed to blame? Well, during World War II, pilots had the perfect scapegoat: gremlins. These weren't real creatures, obviously, but to hear pilots tell it, gremlins were tiny troublemakers who lived inside aircraft and spent their time sabotaging perfectly good planes. They'd mess with the fuel lines, jam the landing gear, or cause instruments to give false readings. Gremlins supposedly had green skin, wore red jackets, and carried little toolkits for maximum mischief. The whole gremlin phenomenon started with British Royal Air Force pilots in the 1920s, but it absolutely exploded during World War II. Suddenly, every unexplained mechanical failure had a supernatural explanation. Engine trouble, gremlins, radio problems, more gremlins. Emergency landing in enemy territory because your compass started spinning like a carnival ride. You guessed it. American pilots picked up the gremlin stories when they started working alongside the RAF. Soon, airfields on both sides of the Atlantic were buzzing with gremlin tales. Pilots swapped stories about these invisible saboteurs like they were discussing the weather. Some aviators claimed gremlins were about 6 inches tall and incredibly strong for their size. Others insisted they could multiply faster than rabbits when they found a plane they really wanted to destroy. But here's where it gets interesting. These gremlin stories weren't just random superstition, they served a very real psychological purpose for men flying death traps thousands of feet above the ground. When your plane started acting up over enemy territory, blaming gremlins was a lot easier on your nerves than admitting the aircraft might just fall apart on its own. Fighter pilots faced incredible stress during World War II. They were flying machines that were built quickly, often with substandard materials due to wartime shortages. Mechanical failures were common, and pilots knew that any mission could be their last. Having a mythical explanation for equipment problems gave them something to joke about instead of dwelling on their mortality. The military brass initially tried to discourage gremlin talk, thinking it made the pilots sound unprofessional. That plan backfired spectacularly. The more officers tried to stamp out gremlin stories, the more elaborate they became. Pilots started claiming different types of gremlins specialized in different kinds of sabotage. Engine gremlins were apparently different from radio gremlins, who were totally different from navigation gremlins. Some squadrons developed entire gremlin mythologies. They'd describe gremlin hierarchies, with senior gremlins directing junior gremlins in complex sabotage operations. Pilots claimed gremlins held meetings to plan their next attacks and had personal vendettas against certain aircraft or pilots. Then Hollywood got involved. The Walt Disney Company heard about the gremlin phenomenon and decided to turn it into entertainment. Disney artists started drawing cute cartoon gremlins for military publications and training films. These weren't the malicious saboteurs from pilot folklore, but rather mischievous cartoon characters that looked more annoying than dangerous. Author Roald Dahl, who was a Royal Air Force pilot before he became famous for writing children's books, wrote an entire book about gremlins in 1943. Disney bought the rights and planned to make it into an animated movie. The project fell through, but Dahl's book helped spread gremlin stories to civilians back home. What's really fascinating is how quickly gremlin stories spread beyond aviation. Ground crews started blaming gremlins for mechanical problems with tanks, trucks, and artillery. Navy personnel claimed gremlins were responsible for everything from engine troubles to navigation errors. Even factory workers began attributing production problems to gremlin interference. The gremlin phenomenon reveals something important about how people cope with stress and uncertainty during wartime. When you're dealing with life or death situations and equipment you can't fully trust, having a shared mythology helps build camaraderie and provides a way to discuss fears without admitting you're terrified. Military psychologists later studied the gremlin stories and found they actually helped pilot morale. Instead of feeling helpless when equipment failed, pilots could blame the gremlins and move on to solving the problem. It was a surprisingly effective coping mechanism, disguised as silly superstition. By war's end, gremlin stories had become so embedded in military culture that they survived long after the fighting stopped. Pilots continued swapping gremlin tales, and the stories eventually made their way into civilian aviation, where they persist to this day. The legacy lived on in unexpected ways too. When the 1984 movie Gremlins hit theaters, many World War II veterans recognized the mischievous creatures, even though the film had nothing to do with aviation. Those tiny troublemakers had evolved from wartime folklore into pop culture icons. While pilots were dealing with their invisible saboteurs, Codebreakers were working frantically to crack very real enemy secrets that could change everything. Picture a typewriter that went completely insane. That's basically what the Germans called their greatest secret weapon, the Enigma machine. This wasn't just any ordinary codemaker. We're talking about a mechanical beast that could scramble messages into millions of different combinations every single day. The machine looked innocent enough, about the size of a heavy typewriter, sitting there with its innocent keyboard and little lights. But don't let that fool you. When a German operator pressed the letter N, the machine might spit out the letter Q. Press N again immediately after, and you'd get M instead. The internal rotors kept spinning, changing the code with every single keystroke. Here's where it gets wild. The Enigma had over 150 trillion possible settings. That's trillion with a T. German commanders genuinely believed their messages were completely safe. They'd send battle plans, troop movements, submarine locations, everything through these machines. Why wouldn't they? Breaking this code seemed mathematically impossible. Well, they were wrong. Dead wrong. Enter a quiet English countryside estate called Bletchley Park. Looks like the perfect place for a boring weekend in the country, right? Actually, it became the most important secret base of the entire war. The British government stuffed this mansion full of the smartest people they could find. Mathematicians, chess champions, crossword puzzle fanatics, language experts, even a few poker players thrown in for good measure. The star of this brilliant circus was Alan Turing. This guy's brain worked differently than everyone else's. While other people saw impossible math problems, Turing saw patterns waiting to be discovered. He didn't just want to crack individual messages, he wanted to build a machine that could break the Enigma system itself. But here's the thing about Enigma. It wasn't perfect. German operators made tiny mistakes every single day. They'd use their girlfriend's name as part of the daily code setting. They'd send routine weather reports that started the same way every morning. Some lazy operators would just mash the same 3 keys when they needed random letters. These human errors became golden opportunities. Turing and his team called them cribs, predictable pieces of text that appeared in German messages. If you knew a message probably contained the words weather report somewhere, you could work backwards to figure out that day's settings. The British built massive code-breaking machines called bombs, not bombs that exploded, but mechanical computers that tested thousands of combinations per hour. These contraptions filled entire rooms with clicking, whirring, calculating madness. They'd run through settings until they found one that turned gibberish into readable German text. Then there's the incredible part nobody talks about enough. Once the British started reading German messages, they faced an impossible choice. If they acted on every decoded message, the Germans would realize their codes were broken. So British intelligence had to let some attacks happen. They'd sacrifice smaller targets to protect bigger secrets. Sometimes they'd stage fake reconnaissance flights over areas they'd already learned about through Enigma intercepts. This gave them plausible cover for knowing about German movements. Other times they'd accidentally discover information through fake captured documents or made-up spy reports. The decoded messages revealed everything. Submarine patrol routes in the Atlantic, German troop buildups before major offensives, supply shortages affecting entire army groups, Hitler's personal orders to his field commanders. The British were essentially reading Germany's mail every single morning with their coffee. One of the biggest Enigma victories came during the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. But once Bletchley Park cracked the naval Enigma codes, convoy routes could avoid submarine patrol areas. Ships that would have been torpedoed sailed safely to port instead. The security around this operation was absolutely insane. Workers at Bletchley Park couldn't tell their own families what they did for work. They'd go home every night and make up boring cover stories about filing paperwork or analyzing weather patterns. The truth stayed buried for decades after the war ended. Historians estimate that breaking Enigma shortened World War II by at least 2 years. Think about that. 2 fewer years of bombing, starvation and death. Millions of lives saved because some brilliant minds figured out how to outsmart a machine that was supposed to be unbeatable. And the weird part is, most of the world had no idea any of this happened until the 1970s. For 30 years the codebreakers kept their mouths shut. They went back to normal jobs, raised families, and never mentioned they'd helped win the war with pure brainpower. The Germans never figured out that Enigma was compromised. Right up until the end, they kept believing their codes were secure. But speaking of things that seemed secure until they absolutely weren't, the war itself was about to reach its strangest conclusion, complete with some truly bizarre survivors nobody saw coming. After 6 years of absolute chaos, World War II finally came to an end. The guns fell silent. The bombers returned to their bases one last time. But the strangest part wasn't the victory parades or the celebrations in the streets. It was what happened next to all the bizarre leftovers of history's weirdest war. Picture this: war orphans wandering through destroyed cities, speaking in code words they'd learned from resistance fighters. Some kids could identify aircraft by sound alone. Others knew how to make explosives from household items. These children had grown up in a world where knowing the difference between a Messerschmitt and a Spitfire could mean life or death. Now they had to learn how to be normal kids again. Then there were the animals. Remember those anti-tank dogs the Soviets trained? The ones that survived had to be retrained not to run toward tanks. Military dolphins went back to just being dolphins. Carrier pigeons got retired from their dangerous message delivery jobs. Some of these birds had flown through artillery fire and survived multiple combat missions. Now their biggest challenge was finding breadcrumbs in the park. But here's where things get really strange. Decades after the war ended, people kept discovering the most incredible stories hidden in attics, buried in government files, or locked away in family secrets. A grandmother would die, and her grandchildren would find medals they'd never seen before, or love letters written in code, or photographs of her standing next to what looked like a fake tank that was actually part of the Ghost Army. The weird part is how many of these stories stayed buried for so long. Take the Monuments Men who hunted down stolen Nazi art. They found masterpieces hidden in salt mines, wrapped in blankets like sleeping children. Some paintings worth millions of dollars were discovered behind false walls in bombed-out buildings. Even today, valuable artwork occasionally surfaces in someone's basement with a story that traces back to World War II. Let's not forget the technology that seemed like pure science fiction at the time. The British ice aircraft carrier plans were so secret that some engineers worked on the project without knowing what they were building. When the war ended, the prototypes just melted away, literally, but the blueprints survived, and decades later, engineers realized how close they'd actually come to making it work. And what about all those code breakers at Bletchley Park who cracked the Enigma machine? They went back to being teachers, librarians, and mathematicians. For 30 years they kept their mouths shut about the most important work of their lives. Imagine having a secret that big and not being able to tell anyone. Not your spouse, not your children, not your best friend. Some of the most unbelievable discoveries happened by pure accident. In the 1990s, construction workers in Germany found a buried cache of documents that revealed details about weapons projects that sounded like they belonged in a comic book. Giant space mirrors to focus sunlight. Submarines designed to look like whales. Plans for underground cities that could house entire armies. The Japanese fire balloon program left its mark too. For decades after the war, hikers in American forests would occasionally stumble across the remains of these paper balloons. Most were harmless by then, but some still contained unexploded bombs. Forest rangers had to learn how to identify and safely dispose of 60-year-old Japanese explosives. Then there's the human side of all this weirdness. Veterans would come home and try to explain to their families that they'd spent the war pretending to be a fake army, or dropping fake mail on Germany, or teaching bats to carry tiny bombs. Who would believe stories like that? Many veterans just kept quiet, figuring no one would understand anyway. The Night Witches returned to civilian life in the Soviet Union, where many of them became commercial pilots or flight instructors. But they'd gone from flying silent bombing missions in canvas biplanes to piloting passenger jets. Talk about a career change. Even the spies had trouble adjusting. After years of creating false identities and living double lives, some agents struggled to remember who they really were. There are documented cases of former spies who continued using fake names and cover stories long after the war ended, simply because deception had become second nature. The truth is, World War II didn't just end with surrender documents and victory celebrations. It left behind a trail of the most bizarre, unbelievable, and sometimes hilarious stories in human history. Stories about bicycle battalions and ghost armies. About dead rats filled with explosives and ice ships that never sailed. About ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary situations and somehow made it through. These weren't just military strategies or weapons programs. They were real people doing impossible things in impossible times, leaving behind a legacy of creativity, desperation, and pure human ingenuity that still amazes us today.